Hello everyone and welcome back to 404. In this episode I sat down with current Labour spokesperson for Higher Education, Innovation and Research and member of Seanad Éireann, Annie Hoey. In the interview we talked about Annie's journey through politics, from her time in third level education and working with the Union of Students Ireland to her election to Meath County Council and later Seanad Éireann. If you'd like to get in contact with the podcast about anything relating to this episode, or even just to recommend a guest or ask a question, you can email us at johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. That's johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. Now, with the formalities out of the way, please sit back, relax and enjoy. Perfect. Annie, thanks a million for joining me today. First of all, on your own personal level, how would you describe yourself to someone who didn't know you, and how would you describe your values as a politician?
I suppose I'm all about fairness and equality. I suppose that's kind of the driving force for things, and there's lots of discussion around the term equality. You should probably really say equity, I suppose. But even from a very young age, felt very frustrated when people were treated unfairly, and always got me riled up, whether it was because the boys were killing snails in the schoolyard and I felt that wasn't fair, and that kicked off my animal rights stuff, or because in secondary school I was really affronted that I went to an all-girls school, that we weren't allowed to bring girls to our debs, and I was like, what about if someone is going out with and I was, even from that, so I was always found those things. So I mean, I suppose that's kind of, I suppose it explains who I am, maybe not necessarily the values or the words that you want, but it's all about fairness and opportunity for people, and how people of power, how they wield that power to either make those situations better or worse for people. And I think when you have a position of whatever it is, whether it's on a committee, in a school board, all the way up to being a government in opposition or otherwise, you need to use that to the best of your ability for whoever it is that you feel is being disenfranchised.
Yeah, and going on from that, because you mentioned education a little bit there at the beginning, talking about, you obviously went to UCC and you studied a bachelor's in arts and drama and theatre, and then went on to study in comparative and world literature, and then you did a postgraduate in women's studies. So that obviously probably comes back to your whole interest in more equality and, as you said, equity. But what kind of really drew you to those subjects when you were first going to college?
I suppose drama and theatre studies, because I was involved in youth theatre. It was the best thing I ever did in Drogheda Youth Theatre, and I loved it. I love getting that opportunity to be a variety of other people and to play. Theatre, while it was really tough, a lot of it was about play and how to explore ideas and stuff. So when I was in my undergrad, I wasn't involved in anything, by the way. I just did my undergrad. I wasn't involved really in clubs and societies too much, a little bit around dramatic, but it was only when I went and did my postgrads that I threw myself into getting involved in college life, if you will. But definitely when I was doing drama theatre studies, performing, we talked a lot about social issues through theatre and performing them and stuff, and it was just such a brilliant subject for kind of opening up your mind to a lot of things. And even getting to, I wasn't hugely into performing per se. I mean, I did it. Even getting to play with characters and look at things from other perspectives and stuff it's a great thing to do. And then I suppose obviously then when I did women's studies and world literature and stuff, then that kind of got me a little bit more focused in on the politics of the world, particularly women's studies, where we had some really great feminist lecturers and stuff who took us through all sorts of different ideas. And this was all before repeal happened. The legislation for the X case finally came about during the time when I was actually doing women's studies, around the protection of life during pregnancy. So it was an incredible time to be a part of the women's movement, if you will. It was because it was such a fraught period. There was a lot of high tensions around finally getting that protection of life. Took 20 years to get it done. So it was a really great time to be kind of learning about that area. And what better year than when it's actually happening in real life.
Yeah, so you talked a little bit there about, feminist thinkers and getting involved when you did your postgraduate in women's studies. But I think I read as well, you set up the Feminist Society in UCC at the time as well, wasn't it? So was it college more so that really got you involved in, say, not only the women's movement, but politics in general? Or was it always sort of an aspect of your life when growing up?
I think it was kind of always maybe a little bit in the background. As I said, when I was in school, I was really affronted in primary school about the boys killing snails. So I set up this group called Snail Patrol, where we effectively patrolled the schoolyard and brought the snails to safety. And then someone ratted us out. We had like membership badges and stuff and like a semi-uniform. It was a bit of an underground resistance. And then someone ratted us out, and the teacher was like, anyone who's in Snail Patrol has to throw away, you have to effectively stand up in front of the class and denounce Snail Patrol. And I was like, I'm not doing it. And so we had an underground Snail Patrol movement going for a while. So I mean, I think this has always kind of been in me, this kind of seeker for things. But when kind of, as happens in secondary school, you kind of distract yourself a little bit with all sorts of other things to be doing. And then, yeah, like, so it was always there. And then I was just really lucky. UCC was a great place to be able to throw yourself into things. And I think college and university and learning are great opportunities to be able to explore things that you wouldn't have. When would I ever get a chance to set up a feminist organization other than when I was in college? It was a really great, even though it took us years to get it set up and we kept being rejected every year because we couldn't have a single issue society. So I won't go off on a rampage about the frustration of that. So I mean, I think it was always in the background that UCC just gave me the tools and the opportunities to actually really explore and the time. Like that's really, people talk about education like, oh, they're just, it's whatever, they're just faffing around. Like it's a really important time to actually be able to critically engage with things and opportunities to try new things. And most people, when they reflect back on their college experiences, are talking about those kind of things. Like that's how, like Facebook came about because there's a group of friends who wants to keep in contact with each other while in college. I mean, good or bad or whatever we want to say about Facebook, that's a different conversation. But you know what I mean? Like those were things that came about while people had that experience and time to actually explore new ideas. So it's so I suppose, yeah, it was always there in me, and UCC gave me the tools and the opportunities to really get stuck in.
Yeah, because I suppose whenever it's always talked about, students learning to critically assess things and, to start questioning the world around them, when it comes to that, everyone sort of thinks about college as that sort of breakthrough from, people who are teenagers going into adulthood and then, learning different things about the political sphere and how it works and everything. But I suppose most people kind of associate that when going to study, say, law and then learning it through their lecturers, whether they study constitutional law and they think this is wrong and that's right and all this. But most of the time, for a lot of people, as you said, it goes through society life and, people meeting like-minded people, and then people they have no agreements with at all, or maybe the people they have never met before in their life, people who aren't even in the same realm as they are, but they end up, getting to understand those perspectives and then learning from it and becoming better people. So I wholly agree with the whole idea of that, what you just said. Let's just move on a little bit, because you were a member of USI for, it was 4 or 5 years, was it?
Yeah, so I was elected to USI for 3 years, and then would have been as a member organization when I was in UCC Students' Union. Then I did a year there, so it was a couple of years banding around both local student politics and then national student politics.
Yeah, but during your time in the USI, you subsequently became the president at one of the stages as well. So that must have been like, I wouldn't want to speak on your behalf because I don't know that much about it, but I would imagine it's a monumentous task to run an entire union, especially for such a large group that are extremely vocal about political issues in Ireland. So what made you want to get involved with USI to begin with?
I suppose, as I said, I was in UCC Students' Union. I was the deputy president there, and UCC has had a very strong history with USI, particularly for the equality officer role, which is what I first went into. The UCC and women ended up holding the equality officer role for 6 years running. So I don't know if it was fate or if I just happened to find myself there. But I suppose it was a natural fit for me. As a member of the LGBT community, we knew that marriage equality was coming up, and it was a really great opportunity to be involved in that and to be, I ended up coordinating and leading the Students for Marriage Equality campaign. I knew repeal was going to be coming down the line soon after that, and because I was the president of USI and I was a woman president, the second only in like 23 years, although now there's a busload of women presidents, which has been great. I got to present to the Citizens Assembly, so it was a really good time to be involved. And it was the last couple of years have been very politically exciting for Ireland. So it just made absolute sense for someone who was interested in social issues, particularly social justice, and two that were very close to my own heart, as I said, wanting to have that marriage equality, and also as a woman wanting to be able to have control over my own body, there would have been nowhere else that I could have been other than stuck right into the student movement. And I was very lucky that the timing worked out and that I got to be a part of that.
Yeah. So you must, I suppose, in a sense, given all that experience with higher education, you were probably delighted when Labour named you their spokesperson for higher education, innovation and research. So what in that position then are you hoping to sort of achieve with it?
Well, I mean, I suppose that it's a new department. Higher education has, the primary and secondary education has always been the focus. So it's a great opportunity to actually get focus put onto the higher and further education landscape. I don't think we really have had a very clearly articulated vision for what a fully holistic education system in Ireland looks like, all the way from early years right to lifelong learning. So I think it's great to be a part of that narrative and to be able to put forward, certainly from a democratic socialist perspective, education and what that means, and access to education, who's in the room, who's not in the room, and all those things that just have been pushed under the rug for quite some time. Obviously, a huge issue is around funding. I've been banging this drum for the Castles report was the very first thing I had to do with when I was president of USI, real baptism in fire. And like that's been going on for 4 years now, and we still don't have anywhere on that. I think they'll have to make a decision around funding fairly soon. So it's a great opportunity to have those voices actually centralized at the table, instead of competing very heavily with the primary and secondary, which rightly so got a huge amount of focus. So I think it's, and also to put forward this idea of who is in education, who isn't in education. And I think, to be fair, Simon Harris is very strong on that, who is in the learning spheres and who's not in the learning spheres. So I think it's a great opportunity to put forward that kind of, as I said, I'm only recently out of the student movement, so still say we and consider myself a part of it. So it's great to actually be able to have that closely linked student movement perspective in this kind of national parliament debate around further and higher education.
Continuing on, obviously I mentioned that you were a Labour spokesperson. The question then bears, why did you choose to join Labour, and when did you choose to join Labour?
Everyone always asks this, and it's as if, and like people kind of expect like the ping, moment, but I kind of just always was. There's no in UCC we had a really great kind of political grouping of friends from all sorts of political backgrounds. We all kind of got on very well with each other, and I was always very closely aligned with the Labour grouping. And as someone who, as I said, for things like reproductive justice and marriage equality, when Eamon Gilmore was president of the Union of Students in Ireland in the 70s, he was calling for civil equality for LGBT people. So I mean, and someone who the day I turned 18 joined a trade union. I just found whichever union I could join. I'm very much about workers' rights, trade unions, equality for people. So I mean, that's just kind of where I found myself. There was no shazing pazam moment. It was just a fit, and it's just how it worked. And I'm very lucky to have been when you're in the student movement, you wouldn't be involved very politically. So I would have left that behind for a while, and then was able to get involved then on the other side of it. It's quite a fraught position to be in if you're politically aligned, and rightfully so. You do tend to put that away because you work with all parties and none when you're in the student movement.
Yeah, and just to continue on from that, and I mean no offense by it as well, because at the time during the 2011 to 2016 government, obviously Labour and Fine Gael were, I suppose, to put it mildly, not very admired by the student body at the time because of certain bits of legislation that come in. I think I remember very much so back in 2010 the protest against Eamon Gilmore for when he raised student contribution fees. But the whole what I'm trying to get at is, what was it then afterwards? Because obviously you had been involved at USI from 2013 onwards. After then finishing, did you look at Labour and say, these may not have been the crowd that were, great at the time when they were in government, but I see there's a good bit of change and I want to get involved now? Or what was the whole sort of story behind that?
Well, I can tell you, I was outside Leinster House as well, protesting and giving it socks. But I also, I think you can also look at the history of a party, and Niamh Brathnach was the Minister for Education in the 90s, and I'm an enormous fan of hers. And she actually came down to UCC during her student union training, and sorry, and spoke to us about education and the value of education. I remember just really being struck by her, and she was really encouraging of me. And at no point at this, by the way, had indicated I was going to ever run for politics or that I was even going to go beyond UCC Students' Union. And she was so encouraging to me. And I just always think that if there are some really good people, and if that's the ethos that a party can espouse, you know, Jed Nash, when he was minister, increased the minimum wage, like, you know, stuff like that, that I think is really important. Like, you know, when there was cuts going left, right, and centre, the first thing they did was to increase the minimum wage and to begin the campaign towards a living wage. And he very much brought in the student movement and very much made sure that our voice and opinions as people who represented, obviously, a lot of people who would have been working on minimum wage, you know, so there was opportunities there to be involved in really important issues.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, as I said, kind of post the student movement, you kind of look around and you see whose values align with you. And as I said, I'm about workers' rights. I'm about marriage, you know, social justice issues. And that's where I found myself aligning. And I think that you can recognize sometimes not everything goes right. And it's very easy to hurl from the ditch when you're not the ones that are in government. It's very easy to hurl from the ditch when I wasn't in the room. But I like to think that I'm kind of in the room now, well, certainly an opposition point of view, and someday could be in the room. And I want to make sure that you know, I'm part of a party that will do the best that we can with good values and honest politics. And that's where I found myself then, the Labour Party.
Obviously now you're a member of Seanad Éireann, and you ran for local elections back in 2019, and then also in 2020 you ran for the general election. And I've met a few people at this stage who've ran for the general election and then ran for the Seanad after, and I think to myself, how do people like this keep going? Like, because honestly, the running for Seanad election, especially on the vocational panels, seem like an absolute trek, to be honest, because you have to contact all the councillors, you have to contact members of the incoming Dáil, the outgoing Seanad. It seems very bizarre and always just a strange system to work your head around. But how would you describe maybe the differences in running for the Seanad as opposed to, say, local or, you know, the Dáil?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a really interesting election. Like in the last 7 years, I've ran in 9 elections. Because USI is a national election as well. It's between, and it's also Northern Ireland and the Republic. It's an all-Ireland election, and I did that 3 times as well. So there's a lot of elections in my past in the last few years. So I'm fully electioned out at this moment in time. I mean, the locals was I only threw my name in the hat 4 weeks beforehand, like this real annoying pipsqueak that came along at the very last minute and swooped in and took a seat. I mean, I would be deeply frustrated at me as well. The locals was a really enjoyable election. Actually, it was May, it was April, it was real fun. It was my first kind of time dipping into this kind of election. It was very positive. And then the general election was just like, it was February, it was miserable, it was awful. I don't know anyone who enjoyed the general election in 2020. And then the Seanad is just this absolute, I still don't to this day quite understand how the Seanad election works. It is just this chaotic horse trading, bunkers, you're driving up Boreens, trying to find someone who might give you a vote, wink, wink. You know, it's absolutely bananas. Yeah. Utterly bonkers. I remember I spent an entire day driving around the county and not a single soul was home. Like, it's a really difficult campaign. It's a very lonely campaign. Yeah, the Seanad it is not for the faint-hearted. It is that is a really difficult campaign. And then obviously halfway through the Seanad campaign, we had to call off in-person campaigning, which, you know, the pros and cons to that, I'll tell you that much, because the virus began to spread. So then it became a phone call banana situation where my phone was ringing because I was also a councillor, but then I was ringing other people and the phone was just effectively nearly on fire in my pocket. So the Seanad election is a very difficult election. It was really hard. There's no other way to put it.
Well, speaking with the voting aspect of the Seanad elections anyways, because I think officially it's 1,130 eligible votes there are, obviously, as I mentioned, from the at least for your panel, the agriculture panel, and all the other vocational panels. So that would include, you know, members of the current incoming Dáil, the outgoing Seanad, and then county and city councillors, as I mentioned. Can you kind of, I suppose it's difficult in its own sense, I think, for anyone to try and explain, but at least to the best of your ability, can you explain kind of how it works? Because on paper, you know, it says Annie Hoey got 94,000 votes, but you're thinking 94,000 people didn't vote. So how does it work now? Because it's not very much like preferential voting. There's some weird mathematics that goes into it with second and third preferences and whatnot.
There is, and I'm not as au fait with it as there are some real geniuses behind the scenes who know how these things work. Yeah, so eventually they transfer to every vote counts for 1,000 votes.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how you end up then in the tens of thousands, which makes sense because once you start getting down into it becomes all about fractions. So there are people who did not get elected by 1/10 of a vote.
Mm-hmm.
So that's not even one person's whole vote. It's 200 out of the 1,000. It is a really complicated, I will say it is a really complicated system.
Mm-hmm.
And there's these thing called packages that kind of start coming in at the end. Parcels, packages, I can't remember what they're called. I remember watching it on the screen being like, what is this? What's happening? You know, like we were trying to follow it and we were just like, I was like, what's happening now? You know, so it is extremely complicated. There is no point in me even like trying to, but that's how you end up with the thousands, is that it's for every vote out of the whatever 1,000 amount, just over 1,000 people vote, each of their one votes transfer to 1,000 votes. That's how you then end up with, you know, into the 90,000 of votes. And it's to allow for then when the transfers start happening for it to be mathematically possible, as opposed to ending up with all sorts of crazy decimal places happening. I think they designed it to try and make it easier to transfer the votes, but I don't know. I'm sitting there looking at it being like, this is a complicated system. It is very difficult to understand. And there's I'd say a whole lecture someone could do on how the transfers work. But the reason it's moved into the thousands is to allow for the transfers to go down the line.
One thing we've heard with the Seanad recently, and the Seanad I think has been the busiest it's ever been since a Seanad, because they have to rush through so many bills and legislation with regards to COVID-19. But outside of all that chaos and all the bills running through there, I keep seeing the word reform for the Seanad coming up again and again. And I know Malcolm Byrne has been talking about it quite a bit from the government perspective. And I think recently there was a bill put through that it would allow anyone who received a higher education to vote in the Seanad, as opposed to, say, the NUI graduates and the Trinity graduates. And obviously, I like a lot of people who aren't currently in an NUI college would see that as a great opportunity to make my voice heard in the Seanad. But on the current state of the Seanad, is it fine as it is, or is there still a lot of work to go to make it more inclusive for people? Because there is that sort of, you know, you can't vote in it if you don't go to a higher education. And then there's also the big debacle with the Taoiseach's 11 nominees, which seems wholly undemocratic when you think about it. So like, there's a lot of people excluded from that process. So what's the workaround to that, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, and there is this, there is a Seanad reform bill that was worked through in the last Seanad, like to change the Taoiseach's nominees, that requires a referendum. Constitutional referendum. But there is a piece of legislation which will look at expanding the franchise that will not require a referendum. So the Taoiseach's nominees would remain as they are because that's a constitutional thing, but then there would be it would give universal franchise to everyone. So effectively, you decide which panel you want to vote on and you register yourself to vote on that panel. So you could be like, well, I feel like I'm most aligned to the culture panel, so I'm going to register to vote on the culture panel, and then you'll get a vote on that one. And you pick which panel you decide you align with most. So that's one of the proposals. And then around the universal franchise for higher and further education. But I mean, even in terms of the kind of work the Seanad does in and of itself, that needs to be looked at as well. I think like it's supposed to be legislative scrutiny. Like that's the whole point of the upper house, is to have two different houses so that something just doesn't get pushed through into one and then it suddenly becomes law. You know, and I think it is good and important to have the two bodies. But I mean, I certainly have found that it is quite stagnated. You know, you're given 6 minutes and that's it. Like that is the level of debate you kind of get now. 6 minutes to discuss something. I actually had to ask someone how a normal bill works going through the Seanad, because my only understanding of bills currently in the Seanad is that we do an entire bill in a matter of hours. So when someone's like, oh, the second stage is going to happen, I was like, I'm sorry, I have no idea what that means. Does that mean tomorrow then we'll go through it again? Or they're like, no, it takes ages. And I was like, oh, okay. Because my only understanding of it is that we hurtle through every single piece of legislation at the speed of light because it's all an emergency, except for things like, of course, sick pay. You know, heaven forbid that would be considered an emergency during a global pandemic. Why would we in a million years, you know, anyway. So yeah, it's I think even internally and the workings and stuff, it's very managed, it's very coordinated. There's not a lot of space for quite free debate. And I think debate is important in a democracy. And when you start locking that stuff down, and I raised that a couple of times in the Seanad, that I was like, not allowing debate on these issues and not allowing debate on amendments is not allowing democracy to flourish.
Yeah, no, and I think in general there was the whole discussion back when the time when the Seanad was up for debate about whether it should be abolished or not, which, we won't get into too much detail now that the current leader of the Seanad is one who, campaigned for its abolition. But at the same stage, though, I think that showed in a lot of respects that people want reform for the Seanad. I think the
Mhm.
consensus amongst a lot of people was if they were voting to keep it, it needs to change. And it's an interesting body in that I always find it whenever you tune into like Seanad Éireann as opposed to the Dáil, I always find it's the more colourful of the two houses of parliament, because you'll have someone who maybe you've never heard of before talking about something. Like I remember the first day I tuned into the Seanad, they were electing Mark Daly for Cathaoirleach. And I was enthralled by David Norris that day. I just think he's an absolute saint whenever you see him speaking. But like, it's just that I'm sorry, maybe I'm gushing a little bit here now for another senator, but like at the same time, like it does open I think to a lot of people in a sense, and specifically the Taoiseach's nominees were meant to fill that void, to give voices to people in communities, who weren't
Mhm.
represented at Dáil level. Like we have the example of Eileen Flynn now, who's
Mhm.
now representing the travelling community. And before, in the previous standard, we had Ian Marshall, who represented the unionist community. And I
Mhm.
think a lot of people were disappointed to see he didn't return to the Seanad. Even people from
Mhm.
Sinn Féin as well, so bridging that gap between nationalists and unionists would have been a huge call for the Taoiseach to make. Do you think, in a sense, that uh, I know it probably was like this from its conception, but the Taoiseach's nominations in general they're not used for what the initial purpose of them was, to give people that extra voice. It's almost sort of a stage to, bolster the government's position within the Seanad now, do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think particularly this time, and I think it was a lot to do with the fact that both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael had done very poorly in terms of women's representation.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to get women into the Seanad to try and deal with that. I mean, in the Seanad, the government has a thumping majority. They've got 40 seats, and
Mm.
then the opposition is 20. Like there was probably no need for them to absorb all of the 11.
Yeah.
Like Eileen Flynn was the agreed shared one, and then they took the rest themselves. Do
Mm-hmm.
you know what I mean? Like they still would have had a thumping majority. So it was a little bit disappointing to see that. Um, and it happens like there has in previous, like the last time, to be fair, Micheál Martin had quite a cross sectoral grouping of people nominated, like Colette Kelleher,
Mm-hmm.
Joan Freeman. It seemed a little less politically driven the last time,
Yeah.
whereas this time it was very, very, very much we're going to pop in our party people, a sibling of someone in a party.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine Martin's brother went in. So that was it was, I certainly think, it was explicitly non putting in just the average representative person outside of Eileen Flynn. I think that was really disappointing, because it is a great opportunity. As I said, the last government, Micheál Martin's nominees, when they kind of did the competence supply, he put in people for mental health and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. So it's a real shame that didn't happen this time.
Yeah. Um, I suppose I'm on to my second last question now, which it feels like it's
Mhm.
flown by at this stage, but I know you're extremely busy, so I won't keep you too long. You've obviously still got a long career to go within the political sphere. I think it's safe to say. You said you've ran for over 7 elections in the last few years, so like I think there's no stopping now. But what would you, if you had to pick a point now, currently up until your time now, what would you say was your proudest moment?
In being involved in things,
Well, being
or
involved in the student movement and the political sphere in general, what would you say was your proudest moment throughout that time?
I suppose one of them, and it's probably a silly one, when I was president of USI, we held a huge student demo. It was the first time we had, I think it was about 12,000 people at it. It was really, really, really big. We hadn't had a demo that big in a number of years. And my proudest thing was that my dad came up to see it, and he was on the stage just watching from the sideline. And my speech blew away. It blew off the podium. Fortunately, I have a degree in theatre and acting. And I remember I just turned around and I saw my dad, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to have to kind of do something here. And I got to bring my dad out onto the stage in front of 12,000 people and say that because of this man, I had an opportunity to be here. Like,
Mhm.
my dad, we did not have a lot of money growing up. There was not money around the place. Um, and my dad and my mom made sure that if I wanted to access education, that was what I got to do. And my mom went back to the Open University. She got to go to college when I was in secondary school. She went to DC Youth, the Open University.
Mhm.
And it was my proudest moment was getting to bring him out and talk about that this is because, at these student things, it's all about us. We're in college, we want this, we want that, we want the other. And I just really, that was my proudest moment, was actually getting to show 12,000 people that all of us have someone, whether it's ourselves, a friend, a parent, a guardian, a neighbor, there's someone with us on this journey. And I just, it was a really great moment. And I remember like the crowd are like chanting like, great, 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 great. And, and like, there's lots of other things I talk about, like presenting the Citizens Assembly, getting elected, winning a seat back for Labour and Meath County Council. But from a very personal perspective, getting to show the student movement and the person who made who I am, who the only reason I was there, the only reason we were there, the only reason we were pushing against fees is because this person believed in me my whole life. So that was definitely just a really special moment, because you don't often get to show off. Sometimes you're special people to the world. And that was definitely my proudest moment.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've never heard anyone answer that question so well before. So that was a really good answer. And my final question now, and again, I hate this question because it always makes it sound like I'm threatened to kill you or something, because it's like, when you're gone, how would you like to be remembered? But obviously, there's still a long way to go. But if you had to maybe sort of think ahead now and think about, you've retired, your career's over, or maybe it's 100, 150 years down the line and people are like, oh, that Annie Hoey, what did she do? How would you like people to remember you by?
I think like the answer you're supposed to give for this is like, oh, I did this big piece of legislation, or I changed this big bill. But I always think you remember how people make you feel. And I really, and I still get people contacting me either from that demo about talking about how that made them feel, and that opportunity, or like people from Pink Training get in touch a few years later and said that, you made me feel seen and that I was a valued person. And I think, I try when I speak in the Seanad, when I raise issues, whether it's about trans rights or LGBT issues or women's rights, that people for whom that affected feel seen.
Yeah.
So there isn't, this is probably a very sappy answer, but it isn't, I mean, there's lots of, I would love to, bring in publicly funded education. I'd love to do all of these things. But I think if I can make people for whom they don't feel that they're being listened to, or that their issues are ever getting a space, like there aren't a lot of people who talk about trans issues in the Seanad, and I get an enormous amount of vitriol for that. There aren't an enormous amount of people who are talking about, women and misogyny and stuff that's still happening, and so if someone looks back and says, God, she spoke truth to power, and she spoke about something that really deeply affected me, that is much more what I would rather be remembered for than, sweeping dramatic legislation. Although I hope I get to do that too. I hope I do get to bring in bills and laws that do make a difference to people's lives. But I think I certainly would hope that I would be remembered for speaking with honesty around issues that are affecting people, and that they feel that they are being heard and seen, because I know what it's like to feel like you're not being heard and seen. So I hope that I can champion some of those issues, and that someone someday will remember down the line that they were valued, that they were important, and what they were feeling was real, and that someone had heard them.
That's fantastic. Annie Hoey, thank you so much for taking the time out today.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.